The English electric Canberra is one of the greatest and most versatile aircraft of all time. Now that statement might seem a bit over the top, especially when you consider how unimpressed everybody was when it first came into service with the RAF in the early 1950s. But 22 world records later, and almost 50 years after the first flight, the Canberra is still there, doing sterling work for many air forces around the world. In those 6 pressure cooker years of the Second World War, aviation technology advanced in leaps and bounds. Aircraft achieved ranges, speeds and payloads undreamed of in the 1930s. The power of the bomber was undisputed, as exemplified in its most potent form in the Avro Lancaster. In the final years of the Second World War, the sights that epitomized the coming victory more than anything else were the huge massed formations of Lancasters droning across Europe to unleash their mighty bomb load on the German heartlands. But by that time, the thrust of bomber design for the future was changing radically. Possibly the most successful bomber of the war was the de Havilland Mosquito. It was small and agile, but it could still carry a 4,000-pound bomb load. But even with that load, the Mosquito could still fly fast enough to outrun most German fighters. It could also fly high enough to avoid the lethal shells from the anti-aircraft gun batteries that ringed all the major German targets. The Mosquito's success was due in no small part to its simplicity. No armament, powerful engines for high speed, a big straight wing for altitude, and a wooden airframe for lightness. So it seemed a good idea in senior RAF circles that the new design for a peacetime bomber should follow the same philosophy. The Mosquito's successor should include the best attributes of wartime developments. It needed to have the range of the Lancaster and the speed, the maneuverability and the bomb load of a Mosquito. But the joker in the pack for Bomber Command was the new and operationally more or less untried jet engine. Since 1930, Frank Whittle had been needling the RAF, at least to consider his jet engines. But a total lack of official interest had meant that he'd had to develop the idea by himself.
Here it is. In the precise language of the engineer, it's called a jet propulsion gas turbine. To you and me, it's the jet engine, one of the marvels of this century of marvels. When they start it up, stand back. Its deep-throated voice will climb to the shrieking of 1,000 fiends. Its flaming breath is white-hot gas, fed by drafts of liquid fuel. Watch that gallon go. And all around, the straining fury of its power sets the very air a-shudder. From Britain's laboratories and factories...
The RAF caught up rapidly in the race to build a jet-powered air force, but until the end of the war, it was amongst the fighters that the paraffin-burning jet engines were to be found. But in fact, aircraft like the Gloucester Meteor and the de Havilland Vampire boasted performance figures that were really not much better than the piston-engined aircraft they replaced. In 1945, the RAF considered for the first time whether they should have jet engines on their next bomber. But by this time, Britain had lost its technological leadership to the United States. The operational requirements of the United States were dramatically different to what Britain needed. US jet bombers were bigger and heavier than anything that had flown during the war. They had highly advanced features like swept wings, engines mounted in pods under the wings, tricycle landing gear, and parachutes that were deployed for braking. But all that was to do with the fact that the US had recognized that a bomber force based stateside would need to fly huge distances across the Atlantic or the Pacific, then drop a large bomb load and finally get home. For Britain, though, likely enemies were nearer to home. A smaller aircraft would do. But when the first Canberra appeared, it was just too small and too light, especially to the wartime RAF leaders. They were used to monster four-engine heavies like the Lancaster. At the same time, the RAF was writing its first specification for a supersonic fighter. So it was a bit odd, really, that both contracts for bomber and fighter should go to a company that had never designed an aircraft before. But the English Electric Aircraft Division, based in Preston in northwest England, had built thousands of Halifaxes and Hamdens, and more recently, Vampires. Under the leadership of W.E.W. Petter, universally known as Teddy, who'd recently arrived from Westland, English Electric set about responding to the Air Ministry's specification. Petter made some basic assumptions. Like the Mosquito bomber, the new aircraft would have no defensive armament. It would rely on speed and altitude to evade enemy defenses. Its aerodynamic shape would be as clean as he could manage, and ideally it would have one jet engine fitted in the fuselage. In all but one of these assumptions, Petter was right. By the time the first Canberra prototype began taxi trials in 1949, the classic, simple shape that would grace the skies for the next 50 years had become apparent. The fuselage was slim and mostly cylindrical. The wings were conventionally straight. Instead of a single engine, two Rolls-Royce Avon jets were embedded in the wings, and the small cockpit was just big enough to hold a two-man crew. Wing Commander Roland Beament, English Electric's chief test pilot, began the trials with slow taxi runs. As he got used to the controls, the runs got faster and faster until the wheels left the ground for fleeting moments. Finally, he was ready to take to the air for real. On Friday, the 13th of May 1949, Roly Beament and the English Electric Canberra took off for the aircraft's maiden flight. Petter had fulfilled his aims. All along, he'd wanted to create a jet bomber that any service pilot could fly, any runway could accommodate, any factory could build, and any air force could afford to buy and maintain. 4 months after that first flight, Beament displayed the Canberra at the SBAC show at Farnborough. He staggered the crowds with a show of agility that couldn't even have been matched by the light biplanes of the pre-war Hendon air shows. Best of all, though, the Canberra's performance was better than the latest marks of both the Meteor and Vampire fighters. Until the arrival of a new generation of aircraft, it would be the fighters that would have to be chasing along behind. The only hitch was that the intended radar bomb sight was not ready in time for the first production models. So a new transparent nose was hurriedly fitted to the aeroplane, and a third crew member who could use a visual bomb sight was added to the complement. So this was the shape when the Canberra B Mark II entered service with 101 Squadron of the Royal Air Force in 1951. In 1950, war had broken out in Korea. The British government had been taken by surprise. The next year, some aircraft were given priority status. Canberra was included, and production was stepped up in earnest. Over the next few years, hundreds of them were delivered, so that by 1955, 26 Bomber Command squadrons were flying Canberras. Apart from a few Avro Lincolns, in fact, the Canberra was just about Bomber Command's only aircraft type. Canberra was about to become a record breaker. In 1953, it won the London to Christchurch air race. Its winning time between Britain and New Zealand was less than 24 hours. This powerful demonstration helped to persuade the Australian government that the Royal Australian Air Force should have the Canberra. 48 aircraft were built there under licence. With the bomber version of the Canberra established in RAF service, the next step was to introduce a photo reconnaissance version. The Canberra's high-altitude performance made it ideally suited to the photo recce role. The first recce Canberra was the PR-3. That went into service in 1952, and it was followed in 1956 by the PR-7. The aircraft's high-altitude performance was actually so good that further improvements seemed possible. Tests at ever greater altitude eventually took the aircraft to an amazing world record height of 70,130 feet. In January 1960, the last and best of the photo reconnaissance versions, the PR-9, joined 58 Squadron at RAF Whitton. The PR-9 had a service ceiling of 60,000 feet, and that took it out of range of enemy interceptors and allowed it to fly virtually unmolested over enemy territory. The PR series of Canberras had greatly improved the RAF's intelligence gathering capabilities. And in fact, PR-9s continue to this day as the last surviving examples in service. The PR-9 is widely considered to be the best of all the Canberras. It incorporates several unique features which distinguish it from earlier marks. The modifications included a new hinged nose, where the navigator sits in his own ejector seat under a fiberglass hatch. He uses a rear-facing periscope under the nose, and he only has the smallest of windows to look out of. In September 1961, the Canberra was taken out of frontline service with Bomber Command. The three V-bombers, Valiant, Victor and Vulcan, had achieved full operational status, and that meant that the RAF now had an impressive and effective force of heavy bombers to carry its nuclear deterrent. But overseas, the Canberra was soon to play an important role in another major war. Early in the development program, Roland Beamont had taken the Canberra on a number of trips to the United States. On one of those trips, he'd set a new record by flying from Aldergrove in Northern Ireland to Baltimore in Maryland in a time of 4 hours and 37 minutes. The US Air Force was very impressed with the handling capabilities. From 1951, the Martin Company built Canberras under license for the US Air Force. In the 1960s, the United States went to war in Vietnam, and amongst the bombers they used was the Martin B-57 Canberra. In 1965, the Rolling Thunder air offensive included B-57Bs conducting low-level bombing missions in which they dropped 1,000-pound bombs and strafed with their 4 20mm cannon. Another variant, the B-57G, was packed with sensors for highly accurate precision bombing, mainly at night. Thousands of sorties were flown and tens of thousands of tons of bombs were dropped. But the US government concluded that against the well-camouflaged North Vietnamese defenses, the bombing campaign had not been effective. Although Bomber Command had retired their frontline bombers in 1961, it was by no means the end of the Canberra's vital roles for the RAF. From 1970 until 1992, B Mark IIs converted to TT-18s were used for target towing. 100 Squadron, based in Cyprus, towed 90-foot banners for interception training for Tornado F-3s and Phantom F-4s. Possibly the most ugly variant of the Canberra was the T-17. Aircrew described it as wart-nosed. Yet the T-17 was in service for 28 years as an electronic countermeasures trainer. Basic role of the T-17 was to provide sophisticated opposition to ground and airborne radars during defense exercises. And it could do this by simulating Warsaw-packed aircraft using jamming and fake radio transmissions. The longest-serving Canberra, flying with the longest-serving Canberra Squadron, was the T-4 trainer of No. 231 Operational Conversion Unit. T-4 was a dual-control aircraft. It was used originally to train future Canberra pilots. Later it proved invaluable for upgrading young pilots who dropped out of fast jet training. Canberra has also found a useful role as flying test beds for various private and government establishments. Flight Refuelling Limited was one such. That was the company set up before the war by the great aviator Alan Cobham. Anyway, Flight Refuelling used Canberra's to test its probe and drogue refuelling system. Other aircraft were fitted with fixed probes that could be inserted into the Canberra's drogue so that they could take on fuel in flight. This simple concept had the instant effect of increasing the range of interceptors and bombers. To celebrate the 40th anniversary of the Canberra in 1989, there was a major display at RAF Whitton, which had been a Canberra station for many years. Canberras of every shape and size flew in to join the lineup and the flypast. As part of the anniversary celebrations, the Canberras flew in a low-level intrusion of British airspace to test the effectiveness of the RAF's Rapier missile squadrons. The Canberras were simulating a ground attack mission by enemy fighter bombers coming in over the east coast of Britain.
Okay, Hornet formation, tactical demonstration. Crews are shown, South Wapo, Jonesy and Bob. Quebec Tango, both TT-18s, 11k on each. No deputy lead, we're on 27 blue and fully serviceable. Diversions, Brighton, Honington, using 3,300 as div fuel. Timing's quite important, we've got to be airborne at 14:21. Time on task, 14:26. And allowing for the fact that one of the aircraft might go US will be starting at 13:55. Flight safety, the only things that apply today from the wind are the turbulence and the wind shear problem. Just watch out for it, a few knots on finals. Crew duty time we're in, soft seats for everybody, orders read and signed. Current documents we have, 28 days current, ratings smart, not low level. We're not flying, night flying, and it's round about 1:30. Any questions? Good.
I'm satisfied.
Walking in 5 minutes.
Good.
Watch out for wake turbulence if there's no crosswind, and we won't bother with any CT. If we lose, we have a spare. Get in it as quickly as you can. If you lose your radios, just hang on, follow me. If I lose my radios, we'll do the display and sort it out afterwards. Lost lead, IMC won't apply, and VMC, if you lose me, just tell me and I'll take a high split from you. Emergency brake, remember we are horn information. Okay, start taxi takeoff standard, runway 27, echelon starboard into wind. With 30-second stream, I'll stay at 200 knots, 7,000 RPM. Leveling at 1,000 feet, turning starboard on 2100. Join up in arrow starboard. All turns will be SOP, departure chips will be in, no times is under effect, no royal flights today, and we don't need frequency cards. We'll start climbing, start where we pull up to 1,500 feet, left-hand dive attack onto 25 squadron. Across 25 squadron, not below 300 feet. Off 25 squadron, turning starboard to stay north of the runway. To run to the end of the 09 threshold, start climbing, starboard turn, up to 800 feet. 800 feet, I'll reverse port, and we'll come round over Aucklandbury to run back in on 09, descending to 250 feet over the runway, 350 knots, and you'll still be an arrow starboard. Running straight down the runway, 350 knots, leaving the threshold, navigators start timing. 4 seconds for the lead, 6 seconds for the number 2. Pull up into a left-hand 2.5 G turn, levelling at 1,500 feet for a second dive attack on 25 squadron again. You'll be about 10 seconds behind me this time, Jonesy, so spacing again below 300 feet on 25 squadron. Not crossing the runway. A nice snappy 2.5 G pull around the corner, please. To disappear to the north at 500 feet. Once you're clear of the airfield boundary, hack it round left, and we'll go around the mouth to the north of Aucklandbury, down south of Winterburn, back to the holding area between us. Any questions?
One moving event during the day was the arrival of Roland Beament to fly a Canberra for the last time. 40 years after he'd taken the first aircraft into the skies, there he was again, climbing into the pilot's seat for an emotional reunion with the longest serving aircraft in the RAF's history. More than 1,300 Canberras were built, including 48 in Australia and 403 in the United States. A lot of them were converted to export versions, and they were sold to 13 countries, as far apart as Peru, Germany, and South Africa. Teddy Petter had truly fulfilled his vision of an aircraft that was affordable by any air force. There is no doubt that with Canberras still going strong after almost 50 years, It has been one of the world's truly great aircraft.